Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk here on VCY America. Ladies and gentlemen, many parents send their children off to school believing that it's for the purpose of instructing their children in the academic disciplines of math and language, science and history. It's to give them exposure to the arts, physical education, and sports. But unbeknown to so many parents is that the classroom has become the test tubes of experimentation and indoctrination of young minds to follow a world system that is antithetical to a biblical worldview, and in many cases undermining parental instruction and biblical instruction on important matters. Well, part of this world system involves the advancement of the lesbian, homosexual, bisexual, and transgender agenda, otherwise shortened as LGBT. And it's not just happening in the United States, but it's all over the world. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not just accidental, but it's purposeful. Here to discuss the UN's targeting of children for LGBT indoctrination, we welcome back Alex Newman. He's an international freelance journalist, educator, and consultant. As a freelance journalist, he writes for The New American, and he is the co-author of the book, Crimes of the Educators. Alex, welcome back here to Crosstalk.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. It's always a pleasure.
Alex, last July you were with us and on Crosstalk, and at that time you informed our listeners that the UN was going to be unleashing this new LGBT czar, and you warned us that the target would be the world's schools. You warned also last year that about the indoctrination that would be coming, and Alex, sad to say, what you warned us about is coming to fruition, in that this LGBT czar happens to be a homosexual activist. Tell us about him.
You know, it's unfortunate. I never like to say, things like "I told you so" on matters like this, because it's so serious and the consequences are so serious. But, I think it was very easy to foresee where this was all going to go. And so, when last we talked, the UN so-called Human Rights Council, and I say so-called because it really is the opposite of a Human Rights Council. I mean, they have some of the world's most vicious mass murderers and genocidal lunatics and communist dictators on there. It really makes a mockery of the concept of human rights. But they voted to create this new special position. I call him the UN LGBT czar for short. I think the formal title is UN Independent Expert on Human Rights of Lesbian, Gay, Transgender, Queer, Intersex, and all these other categories that they're inventing. And at the time there was some indication that they were going to be going for the children. They talked about that they needed to combat public prejudice and stigma. And, we've heard this kind of thing in the United States. The Obama administration was very deeply involved in this, promoting the quote-unquote safe schools program. And so under the guise of ensuring that everybody had a positive view of homosexuality and transgenderism, they started introducing all these programs into the schools to, make children believe that this is all normal, that this is all good and healthy, and so on. And so, there was very clearly some indications that this was what was going to happen. And unfortunately, now this so-called expert has been appointed. His name is, it's hard to pronounce, it's a Thai name, Vivit Muntabhorn or something along those lines. And he's a homosexual activist from Thailand. And, now he started speaking publicly. And I follow the Latin American press pretty closely. I grew up in Latin America, and I came across an interview he had done with Argentinian media. And, it's enough to make your jaw drop to the floor, even when all of this is happening. It's just incredible. He's talking about, the laws are good now, but, some people still have negative views of homosexuality, and so we need to get working more with the children. And they said this, the younger, the better. And he talked about introducing programs into the schools and different activities, and it's very much along the lines of what we've seen for many years now in Western Europe, increasingly in the United States, and they want to take this global. So
now, he is he under the direction then of the auspices of the UN Secretary General, directly Antonio Guterres?
Well, I think technically he works for the UN Human Rights Council. I mean, they call him independent, but the position was created by the UN Human Rights Council. And as I understand it, he answers to the Human Rights Council, which includes, for some examples, the communist dictatorship in China, the communist regime in Cuba, the communist regime in Vietnam, the Saudi Arabian dictatorship, which is a rather interesting thing since homosexuality is a capital offense there, as is converting to Christianity. But yeah, so he technically, I think, answers to the Human Rights Council.
Now, I find it very interesting, as you mentioned, he has a really special interest in reaching young people, and that phrase that you said there, Alex, should really cause the hairs on the back of our neck to stand up when he says, the younger, the better. I mean, they are just wanting to take this young, impressionable mind and mold it into an LGBT activist mind.
That's exactly what's happening, and they understand this very clearly, just as everybody understands that children are vulnerable. They trust adults. Christian parents teach their children to respect authority, and so when the teacher's telling you, "Oh, this is all good and well," that sinks into the minds of children in a way that it probably wouldn't for an adult who already is grounded in their faith and grounded in the Word of God. Those types of things aren't effective anymore, but they realize that if they want to win the battle for the hearts and minds, so to speak, they've got to combat religion, and they've got to do it through the schools. So I think that's what we're seeing. That's what we're going to be seeing. And, this is not the first incidence of this. Just a couple of weeks ago, the United Nations Education Agency, the UNESCO, actually run by a communist, I believe we've spoken about her before, Irina Bokova from the Communist Party of Bulgaria. They put out a report on textbooks around the world, and they said that the textbooks need to be promoting actively what they call sexual diversity. What is meant by that?
What's meant by that term?
Well, on the surface, they say they're talking about homosexuality and bisexuality and transgenderism, and they have new things now like queer and intersex and questioning and all these things. But when you dig down a little further, you see this banner is being broadened, and they're trying to bring in things like bestiality, and they're trying to normalize things like pedophilia. So really, we're getting into some extremely dangerous territory. And this UNESCO report that I mentioned, they actually promote Sweden as a model in this regard, right? They say that Swedish textbooks are very good at promoting homosexuality and transgenderism. And we see the effects of that. The Swedish government produces television shows aimed at very young children, literally promoting transgenderism. I've seen some of them. They had this, I think she was a 10-year-old girl, and she was pretending to be a boy and dressing as a boy. And they had, the heroic music and all the adults showering praise on her for being so brave and realizing and coming out that she was a boy. So this is the kind of stuff that they're involved in. This is the kind of stuff that this new LGBT czar is going to be involved in. And the effects are showing up clearly. In Sweden, we just had some reports come out in the last few weeks showing that the number of children who think they're the opposite gender is doubling every year.
Wow.
So, they say, oh, people are born with this. No, they're not. That's absurd. We can see this in all the evidence that exists.
I find it very interesting. He's saying the younger the better, and folks, that is your children that are being targeted, and children like yours all over the globe. But it's saying the younger the better, and yet we have the American College of Pediatrics and pediatricians who are warning that the targeting of children with this transgender agenda and this indoctrination, they are actually calling it child abuse, Alex.
They are, and I think that's a very appropriate conclusion, because what we're dealing with is adults who should know better, teaching young children that if they feel like they were born in the wrong body, then the solution is to take a bunch of hormones and to really mutilate their bodies. They call it gender reassignment surgery, removing body parts and doing other types of surgery. And this is, I think, the very essence of childhood. I mean, you're distorting a child's mind in a way that's going to leave them with permanent damage. And the real kicker is that, many studies have shown at Johns Hopkins University looked at this years ago, and they found that something like 80 to 90% of children who, claim to be confused about their gender will end up totally normal if you just leave them alone, right? If you don't encourage it, if you don't dress the boy in a dress and tell him how brave he is for coming out as the opposite sex, the kids will end up just fine. Some kids just have this problem growing up, and it's not a big deal if you just let it alone. But if the UN comes in and starts telling you how great it is and how brave you are and how society needs to help you, then you start getting long-term damage. You start getting these kids who really buy into this, and maybe they start hormone therapy, and it becomes too late to do anything about it after the damage has been done.
And children who don't buy into it, I mean, the UN really believes it is their solemn duty to change children's attitudes and beliefs on this.
And that's what they say, over and over and over again. To me, it's just amazing how open this has all become. Because, maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, if the UN had put out a press release and said, it's our collective duty as the United Nations to change the attitudes and the beliefs of children around the world to accept, global citizenship and the LGBT agenda and all these things, parents would have recoiled in horror. And nowadays, I get press releases from the UN, and they brag about this. Their top officials come out and talk about how, using those exact words, that they want to change the values and the beliefs of children. So, we're dealing with something that is now completely out in the open. It's, the media won't report it, but it's not even that it's hidden anymore. It's not even a hidden agenda. It's all there for anyone who cares to look.
Yeah, and that is the question, Alex. Do parents care to look?
Unfortunately, I think a lot have not taken the time that they need to take to look at these things. And, I understand that everybody's busy and, mom and dad have to work to make ends meet and, nobody has time. But these things are, we're talking about the future of your children. We're talking about the lives of your children. What could be more important than that? So I think parents really do need to put some effort into finding out what's going on, finding out, what the agenda is, how it's being imposed, and finding out ways of, counteracting that or avoiding that as much as possible.
Alex Newman is with us here today on Crosstalk. We're talking about the UN targeting of children for LGBT indoctrination. And folks, when we have a czar that's been put in place on an international basis by this global body to impact nations all over the earth, his official title here, the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Alex, you were talking about textbooks being used around the world, and do you really mean that? I mean, this is really global and in all different languages, textbooks that are promoting this?
This is happening all over the world. There's a few areas of the world where this has not yet reached. I'm thinking in particular of a lot of the Islamic nations. They do have a lot of very nasty things in their textbook, the derogatory information, slander against Christians and Jews and, things like that. But, they have not succumbed to this pressure on homosexuality. In many of these countries, homosexuality is still a capital offense. And so you can imagine how parents might react if their kid came home from school with pro-homosexuality messages in the textbook. And I get the impression that most of the efforts of this LGBTs are actually going to be focused on, to begin with, at least the Western countries and Latin America and places like that. And so you wonder really what's going on. But, if you look at a lot of Western Europe, it's in the textbooks now.
Folks, we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back from the break, we're going to approach something in which the UN talks about entry points for children, as school being an entry point, and why this is so important for them. You'll be back, and I'll be back here in just 1 minute. This is Crosstalk here on VCY America. VCY America. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Today's program is really one of warning, not only for our nation's children, your children, but that of the children around the world, as this has become a UN endeavor, this LGBT czar, to indoctrinate children, where his philosophy is the younger, the better. Alex Newman is with us today. He's written just a powerful, revealing story on this, and the headline is UN LGBT Czar on indoctrinating children, the younger, the better. It's on thenewamerican.com, thenewamerican.com. Alex, this UN Czar actually that talks about schools as being an entry point for children to be born and bred from a young age, and then speaks about health, education, and religion as being soft entry points. Expound on that with this entry point and soft entry points. What is really meant by this?
Well, thanks for bringing it up. And I should point out, those are his words, right? This is not us. This is not my article saying this. This is not the host of the radio program saying this. This is the word used by the UN's LGBT czar, Mr. Muntabahorn, forgive me for not pronouncing it properly. But so he discusses these different entry points to start introducing children to these concepts of homosexuality and lesbianism and transsexualism and bisexuality. And he lists a few there. So one of them is religion, one of them is education, and one of them is healthcare. And so, so much of the indoctrination that's been going on in the schools has actually come through both under the guise of health and under the guise of education. And so sometimes it's even health education. And so in the health education, they teach children, all kinds of things that I think even liberal parents, even non-Christian parents would in many cases find just absolutely abhorrent. They teach them different sexual things, and this begins at a very, very young age. UNESCO, the UN's education agency, has developed sexual education guidelines, and really they want, by the time children are 5 years old, they want them introduced to concepts that I won't even talk about here on the radio because they're just so inappropriate. And I think this has become, kind of an open secret within the upper echelons of the UN, so they don't go around talking about this very often, especially when they think their critics might hear them. But as we can see from, for example, this interview that he did with an Argentinian newspaper, as we can see from the language he uses, entry points to get the children born and bred into accepting homosexuality, we have people who very literally and very openly brag about the fact that they're coming after children to indoctrinate them into their belief system. And, any Christian who's read their Bible knows that homosexuality is just not a thing that's acceptable. And it doesn't mean that people need to hate homosexuals, but it certainly means that it's not something we promote to vulnerable little children. And yet that's exactly what the UN is discussing and plotting on how to do when it comes to education and health and even religion, which is, very bizarre.
And I think this is really important because, Alex, I've heard individuals who have said, well, I'm going to put my children in public education for their younger years, but when, things really get intense, like in high school, then I'll put them in a Christian school. What you're saying is that the target, the impressioning on the mind will already be in place before that child would ever get to a high school.
That's right, and this is beginning earlier and earlier. We have many recorded instances of this stuff happening as early as kindergarten, where they're reading pro-homosexuality books to children, and Heather Has Two Mommies, I think, was a popular one until it caused outrage among parents. And they were reading this to 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old children, talking about non-traditional families and so on. And they use a lot of very, very non-threatening language to justify this stuff. They say, well, we don't want people to hate homosexuals, so we need to start introducing them to homosexuality when they're 5. One thing doesn't follow the other logically, but they use these kinds of arguments to try to disarm parents, to try to make parents feel bad if they raise any questions. Oh, you don't want your kid to hate homosexuals, do you? Well, then you better let us teach about Heather, who has 2 mommies whose parents are lesbian. It's a very misleading narrative that they're pushing. We certainly don't need to be introducing these concepts to 5- and 6-year-old children to avoid, violence and discrimination and these types of things that they use as a justification. And yet this is what's happening.
And what's happening also is a clash of values here. And what about when there is this conflict between one's religious viewpoint and the viewpoint of the LGBT agenda? And,
it's sad to say that actually this UN LGBT czar specifically addressed this. He was having a meeting at UN headquarters with a number of national delegations and different NGOs, and so they've actually taken the YouTube video offline, so I was not even able to watch it myself, but I did find a number of reports on this, including one from CFAM, the Center for Family and Human Rights, I believe it's called, and they do very good work following the United Nations and exposing what they're up to. And what they said was that a representative of a Christian NGO asked this LGBT czar, so what happens when there's a conflict between religion and this agenda that you're pushing? Then what? And people should read for themselves what this LGBT czar had to say. In so many words, he said, well, when there's a conflict between the two, religious liberty and free speech needs to give way to protection for sexual diversity and homosexuality and gender identity and all these different things. And, it leads into a broader discussion of, what are human rights. And I think a lot of Americans fundamentally misunderstand this, and I think the public schools are in large part to blame for this, but what the UN considers to be human rights are really fundamentally different than what the founders of the United States envisioned as rights. So, in the U.S., in the Declaration of Independence, they wrote, it's self-evidently true that we have a Creator, that the Creator endowed us with unalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, property, happiness, pursuit of happiness, and that governments are instituted to protect these rights. So that's, one view of rights. God gave us rights, and we create governments to protect those rights. The UN has a radically different view, and I encourage everyone to read the UN Declaration on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, because this comes through absolutely clearly. So first of all, it recognizes no God-given rights. It doesn't even recognize a God. So who gives your rights? Well, international organizations, governments, and treaties. And that means that international treaties and governments and so on can take away your rights. And they make this explicit in the text. If you go to Article 29, they tell you that these rights can be limited by law if it's justified by, there's a whole list of things that can justify the limitations on the rights. They also tell you that these rights and freedoms may in no case be used contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So if your religion clashes with the purposes and principles of the United Nations, well, hey, they told you right in their Declaration of Human Rights which one wins out. And so the UN LGBTs are made this quite clear. Religious freedom and free speech have limits. LGBT rights do not.
And folks, understand this point, because if it's your religion that's at clash with these homosexual values, the LGBT agenda, then it's your religion that needs to be changed. I believe in your article you talked about what they call absolute rights and rights that are not absolute rights. And one of those non-absolutes would be the one's right of religion, whereas they would say LGBT is an absolute right.
Precisely. So you have an absolute right to, believe that homosexuality is wonderful and to not be criticized for that belief or for being a homosexual or for homosexual acts. So you have an absolute right to be free from what the UN calls hate speech, which is, in Sweden the government even defined the Bible as hate speech. So that should give everyone an idea of where this is going. So you have an absolute right to be free from discrimination and so-called hate speech over homosexuality or transgenderism, and that, of course, includes, a Christian in love saying, hey, God considers this a sin and many other things a sin, and there's one way to redemption, and that's through the Lord Jesus Christ. But so that would be, hate speech under this view, and so those rights can be limited. The right to preach the gospel and to, call sin, sin. But you have an absolute right not to be offended or, quote-unquote, discriminated against if you happen to be engaged in homosexual activity. And so we see this happening even in the United States. I think a week or two ago, a federal court ruled that, the Civil Rights Act applies also to homosexuality. So under this view of the law, that would mean a church could not decline or could not refuse to hire a homosexual school teacher for kindergartners because allegedly the homosexuality is protected under federal law. It's something that can't be discriminated against. And so that's where this is all moving if people don't rise up and stop it.
Now, folks, keep in mind this LGBT czar is actually traveling the world, nation after nation, to promote this agenda. It's already under full force here in the United States. And Alex, as I read your article, I see you believe that this is really accelerating. I mean, I read that rather than rein in the LGBT lobbying and bullying, the UN, under its present leadership, under Guterres, you use the terms, has hit the gas.
Yep, and it's really, I think, disappointing to a lot of people because we talked about Guterres on the show, I believe.
Yes.
He has a very long track record of being a socialist. He was actually the leader of the Socialist International, which is an alliance of socialist and communist parties, many of which have massive amounts of blood on their hands. And they've openly called in their documents for a world government, for world socialism, for redistributing the wealth of Western countries to third world dictatorships. This is all in the open. So he has a long and I think very troubling track record to his name. But at the very least, a lot of people were hoping, well, he's Catholic and therefore he's pro-life and he doesn't support this LGBT agenda. And based on his past political career in Portugal, 20, 30 years ago when he was in Parliament and served as Prime Minister there were some indications of that. But clearly it was not a principled stand. It was more of a pragmatic stand. And, we've seen the UN, again, go full speed ahead. And you can see this across all the UN agencies. It's not just this UN LGBT czar. It's not just the UNESCO. This is happening across the board throughout all of these UN tentacles.
And this is why, and Alex, let's bring it forth again, you have told our listeners about some legislation, H.R. 193, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, to actually terminate the membership of the United States out from the United Nations.
Right, and this is a very simple bill. It's been introduced in Congress, I think, since the 90s by Congressman Ron Paul and many other great congressmen since then. The latest iteration of it was introduced by Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama, and it's got a number of really great co-sponsors. I mean, the co-sponsor list is like a who's who of the best members of Congress. And it's a very simple bill. It's just, 4 pages long. It says the UN Participation Act is repealed. The UN needs to get their headquarters off of our soil. We're not going to put our troops under UN command anymore. And we're going to withdraw from all the UN agencies, and we're going to withdraw from all the, treaties that purport to dictate policy for the United States. So it's a very simple bill. It would be a clean break with the United Nations, and we could get back to governing ourselves under our constitutional system of government.
It's H.R. 193. Again, folks, it's called the American Sovereignty Restoration Act that would terminate our membership, the membership of the United States in the United Nations. And you can contact your Congress. Thank you. We're out of time. And Alex, was that book Crimes of the Educators?
It is, yep.
Crimes of the Educators. And how is it our listeners can get that book?
It's available everywhere, Amazon, Walmart, online, anywhere you buy books. So.
Great. Okay. Alex Newman, our guest today. Alex, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
And, folks, you can read his article at thenewamerican.com. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the Internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Take Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.